So, a friend of mine, a CISO, recently asked me, Charlene, how do I know which risks I should be quantifying? And that's a really good question. So, I thought that will be the topic of today's podcast. So, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Charlene Deaver Vasquez. I always start off by saying thank you for taking the time to stop by and consume this content. No matter what platform you're listening or watching this on, please be sure to like and subscribe so you can get the next podcast whenever I produce that. So today's topic is how do we know, or how would you know, which risks you should be quantifying? It's a really good question because there's so many risks that we come across and you don't want to miss anything. So it's really hard to know how much effort do we need to put into this. So let's start with just that part of the question alone. How much effort do we need to put into this? A lot of people have this idea, a bias. It comes from just a bad myth that risk quantification is difficult, it takes a lot of time, and it's very hard to do. If that's the way it feels to you, you're doing it wrong. And so the way that I teach risk quantification is that it is really fairly quick and easy to get an initial estimate. And so when we're talking about what risks you should be quantifying, the first thing to know is that this process initially should not take a lot of time, number one. So number two, how do we know which risks to focus on? So here's the way that I suggest approaching it. Let's take any environment. You have some internal audits, some external audits, you have vulnerability data in your environment, and you also have new and emerging risks. So how do you know where to begin to focus and which ones you want to spend some time developing an initial estimate? The way to answer that is that you pick those risks that appear to have the possibility to be material to the organization. Now, what do I mean when I say material to the organization? So when we are managing risk from the beginning, and it doesn't matter what framework you use, they all have this idea embedded into them that the risk management process is aligned with the business goals. So when you are looking at risks and you're saying, okay, how do I pick what risk should I be quantifying? The first question is, how does this risk align with the business goals? So when you are aligning to the business, you should be considering key business functions. You should be considering critical assets, top priority projects, and business objectives. Those are four key things that you should be aligning your vision and your process of managing risk. You should be aligning it to those things because these are the things that the board or leadership has made clear are important to them and are important for the organization. So they should be important to you as well as a CISO, and they should help guide your focus in managing risk. So with that in mind, as you look across the vulnerabilities that come to you through internal audits, external audits, through vulnerability data that you have, or even considering emerging risks or things like AI, Internet of Things, third-party risks, insider threat, all of these, you first want to understand, well, how could that impact the business and how does that align to those four things we said were important to the business? If this risk were exploited, could it have a material impact? In other words, could it have an impact of sufficient size and scope and potentially monetary costs to deal with that it would impact a major business function? Would it impact a critical system? Could it bring a critical system down for a period of time sufficient to be important? What about key projects? Is this something that would lie within key project assets? So if those assets were compromised, that key project could really feel the impact for days, hours, weeks, months. And then as you think of it in those terms, it should become much easier to realize that maybe most of the risks that you're dealing with don't rise to that level. So if you're seeing a risk and you know, well, this is what you would call a control risk. It is something that does provide mitigation factors against certain kinds of attacks, but it's more of a policy or a procedure, and it's not nearly as egregious as having exploitable or code type exploits on key systems. You see the difference between these two? Even though we want to be fully compliant and we want to have very effective policies and procedures, that doesn't equate to the same type of impact that a code execution could have on a critical asset. Does this make sense? So that's the first way you begin to look at all of these vulnerabilities and say, which one of these should I be maybe spending some time on and quantifying? So once you've kind of done this first sweep and you say, okay, now I have a group of risks or threats, vulnerabilities. Now, how do I go about quantifying these? I don't have a lot of time, and I need to have some sense of how can I prioritize these. That's where the tools and the methods that I teach really come into play, because I always say, focus on an initial estimate first, and here is exactly why. You need to move beyond the position of, I don't know, into the position of, I have enough information to make a decision. And the first decision you need to make is, how important is this risk? And for that, to answer that question, all you need is an initial analysis. An initial analysis, you are looking at the threats and the likelihood that a threat actor can leverage that against you. And as soon as you understand these two things, you can quantify the risk. Once you know what that likelihood is, and you now have quantified the risk, then depending on the severity, you move to the next step of saying, okay, if this event occurs, what is the likely impact? And you can look at that either in terms of operational, like how long would this be down, or how severe would this be to systems and processes, or you can look at it in financial terms. What does it cost to deal with that operational outage, in other words? And so you want to consider it in those terms. And that type of initial estimate should never take more than a few moments, or if you need to get some data that you don't have handy, maybe an hour or so. But it should not take you days or weeks, and certainly not months. If you feel like that is what it takes to quantify a risk, then I would say again, you're doing it wrong, that it shouldn't be that complicated. The way that I teach quantifying risk makes it super, super simple. So I won't go into all of the factors that I consider and how I teach that. For that, you just need to stay tuned to more of the podcast, because that will take a little bit of time. But basically, I use tools, models, and I lay my data out in such a way that it becomes very easy to correlate what are my strengths and weaknesses against this particular attack or this particular scenario. And so that brings up another critical aspect when you're trying to decide which risks to focus on. You always think of it in terms of a scenario. So it's not just saying, oh, I have vulnerabilities over here. That's not enough. What does that mean? You have to turn that into a scenario. How could these vulnerabilities be leveraged against you? What is the sequence of events? What is the story? What is the scenario that would lead this vulnerability to becoming an event that would have a substantial impact to the organization? In this part of deciding what risks to quantify, you get to play a what-if game. And it's very important that you do several what-if scenarios. What if, let's say it was a third-party compromise, what's the risk to us? And you might look at that in several ways. Are they supplying some content to you or data? Are they supplying pieces, components of something? Or are they supplying manpower, efforts? What is it that, how is it they're supporting you? How does that come into your environment? And go through 2, 3, 4 what if scenarios, looking at it from all angles, not just one. So many times people think that quantifying risk is a one and done question. And again, that's another myth that's horribly wrong. Instead, risk quantification is an everyday, ongoing, repetitive process. And we should get used to this idea that quantifying risk is something we do all the time. And that's why it's so important in the way that I teach quantifying risk that it must be easy to do, and it must be something that can be done relatively quickly with the data available that you have in hand. And so that goes into the whole point and purpose of the way that I teach risk quantification. It's not about the model necessarily, although the models I use are laid out in a specific way that makes it visually easy for you to connect the dots of where the weaknesses and where the strengths are and how those have direct mitigation effect against the attack. So, to answer the question, 2 things. Number 1, you want the right tools and the right process so that it is easy for you to quickly quantify any risk that you have a question about. And you always want to start with an initial analysis so you can make that first decision. Is this something I should pay more attention to? Yes or no? That's all you have to do in the initial analysis, is to make the first decision. Because this is an iterative process, you're going to come back and redo this analysis, and you're going to do more what if scenarios as you get more information and as things progress. It is not a one and done. It is a constant, ongoing process. And secondly, you're going to focus on those risks, those vulnerabilities, those scenarios that appear to have the ability to have a material impact on the business, and that you have aligned to one of the 4 key business priorities. It is either material to a core function of the business, or a key asset, or a top project, or an objective of the business, that you're going to link it to one of these 4 things. And when you have that initial, okay, it looks like this one might be material, let me focus on it, then you're going to use these tools and you're going to learn how to do this quickly in a matter of minutes or hours, but you're never going to spend days and weeks and months on initial analysis. Not the way that I teach it. And that's what makes the difference. People who don't know that they can do this quickly and relatively easily always tend to put it off, and so they miss the value of being able to quantify the risk, of having that initial analysis, and being able to move past the point of, I don't know, to, I have enough information to make a decision. Okay, I'm going to leave you here. Be sure to join me next time, and we'll continue the conversation. Thanks. I'll see you then.